She is one of the foremost scientific minds in cancer research, and for years, Nancy Hopkins believed the sexism that she faced was the exception until she started talking to other women working at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The fight of these professors for gender equality on campus is now the subject of a new book by New York Times national correspondent Kate Zernike. I spoke with both women earlier this week. Thank you both for talking with us today. Nancy, I'd like to start with you. You'd obviously had made great strides in your cancer research. You were looking at the world of science like a meritocracy, right? And then there was a certain point where you realized the sexual harassment, the assault was not necessarily just an exception for you, but more like the rule. At what point did you realize that it was a pattern for not just you, but many of your female colleagues?
It took about 20 years. I was so certain that if you did a good enough experiment, none of it would matter. So I saw it from the beginning, but I didn't know what it was. And I just thought, well, this is some obstacle. I did something wrong. Maybe I ran into a difficult person. I'll just keep going, keep going. And it really took a while. So after a while, I said, well, wait a minute, you know, this is really a little too difficult. And some of the things were sort of obvious that had to do with being women, but I didn't think they mattered. But there were some I just didn't know. And so I started looking at how other women were treated. And that was what opened my eyes to it. I said, wait a minute, that woman is just as good as that man. How come he's the genius and she's treated as sort of invisible? I mean, this doesn't make sense, really. And I had to see enough examples so that I really finally knew it was true. And there weren't many women, so it took a long time. But the interesting thing was that even when I saw it was really all those other women, I still was able to convince myself that it wasn't happening to me. That you know, my problems were some individual problem or whatever, I'd done something wrong, somebody else done something. Very hard to face the fact that this is happening to you.
I'm curious if I can play devil's advocate here for a moment. At what point, because you said that yourself, initially you thought, well, maybe it's just me, maybe it's just an issue that I'm having. At what point did you decide, and really you were clear, that it was about your gender and not you personally?
Well, I think certainly it took about 15 years to realize it was all other women except me, and then it I made this big switch. And then I realized, yes, okay, it's happening to me, but I can still overcome this if I can just get through this one difficult problem. And then there was the last straw moment when I just realized I couldn't continue to actually work that way. I'd run out of energy to fight these battles.
At what point did you realize? Was it kind of like a call, a knock at a door when you went to a female colleague and said, are you having these struggles? How did that all transpire?
I exhausted all the local administrators, and I wrote a letter to the president of MIT. And I said, dear sir, I'm sure you're a well-meaning person, but honestly, you're discriminating against all the women faculty here, and I think you ought to do something about it. And so I really looked up to this woman. But I thought, she'll think I'm a loser and a wimp but I'm going to show her the letter anyway and just see whether it's dignified and, you know, persuade, and the president might even read it. So we go out to lunch, and we're sitting at this tiny little table, and I'm watching her, and she's reading so slow, and I'm waiting her for say, oh, that Hopkins woman, she's no good, you know. And she's reading, and she puts it down on the table, and she says, I'd like to sign this letter, and I think we should go and see the president because I've believed this for a long time.
That's great.
And that changed my life. It changed MIT. And we looked at each other, and we said, you don't suppose there could be others who feel the same way, do you? Well, guess what? There were.
How did you first hear about Nancy's story?
So I was a reporter at the Boston Globe, and I just got a very generic tip. I still, to this day, can't remember where it came. It was like, you know, through several people. Call this woman, Nancy Hopkins. There's something about discrimination in women at MIT. And I thought, okay, it's 1999. It's probably, you know, a lawsuit or something. You know, how bad could it be, right? 1999, we're on the verge of a new century. So I called Nancy, and she said that they had produced this report about discrimination, but what really got me was that MIT was going to acknowledge that it had discriminated. And the reason MIT had done this is because the women had been so careful to gather data, to gather stories, to make their case. And, you know, the men who MIT ultimately, the president of MIT said, this is a real problem.
Were you all expecting the headlines and the shockwaves when you first revealed this problem?
No, I thought it was a great story because, as I said, MIT was admitting this. I loved the way these women had gone about this scientifically. It just struck me as this very MIT story. And I was really impressed by them, but I didn't think, like, it showed up on the front page. So I do the story for the Boston Globe, it shows up on the front page. I didn't think it was going to show up on the front page in the New York Times 2 days later.
I thought, okay, but it's just these kind of places like Harvard and MIT, you know, which is, you think they're so great. And it didn't occur to me, actually, that it was true everywhere. I mean, this is how naive can you be? I'm sort of embarrassed to say it, but I have to be honest here. So then when this report, Kate's article came out, this deluge happened. I mean, it was just overwhelming. And women were writing from all over the country, literally the world, and saying, thank you for telling the story. It's my story.
And this was back in 1999. Why did you decide now was the time, we're talking more than 2 decades later, for a book to really expand on this?
So in 2018, I was watching the fallout from the Me Too movement, and I thought, okay, it's great that we are understanding now that this egregious sexual assault can happen. Like, that's great. That's obviously a huge revolution, but it struck me that this marginalization that the women at MIT had talked about in some ways was a more pervasive problem and a more stubborn problem because it is so hard to see. And so I thought if I could tell this really intimate story about what happened to Nancy and these women, people would begin to understand the problem and do something about it.
The Exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the Fight for Women in Science is now available wherever books are sold.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.